Thank you. Can you? Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. Thinking the Unthinkable. That was the title of a book published by Herbert Kahn in 1980. At that time, the unthinkable thing was nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Some people would say that a possible war between China and Japan is also unthinkable. But I'm suggesting that, at least for the purposes of this discussion tonight, while not being inevitable, we can say that war between the two countries is still thinkable. Let's just review a few things that just happened in the newspapers in the last week. A Chinese submarine stalked the USS Ronald Reagan, an American aircraft carrier in the Sea of Japan, within torpedo range for the first time since 2006. Two Russian Tupolev long-range bombers buzzed the Reagan and at as low as 500 feet, causing the aircraft carrier to scramble four jets to warn them away. A Chinese long-range bomber passed through the Miyako Strait into the greater part of the Western Pacific. The Miyako Strait, by the way, is the distance between Okinawa and the island of Miyako. It's a very wide body of water, and is the main gateway for the Chinese Navy when it wants to get it out into the open sea. Chinese naval fighters flew exercises over the South China Sea, and they made sure that they published photographs showing that they were armed, and this was in relation with the American freedom of navigation work in the South China Sea a few days before. Compared with what has been going on now in the South China Sea, as you've all been reading, I think, in the papers, things have been pretty quiet in the East China Sea. There hasn't been a major provocation really for the last 2 years when the Chinese set up an air defense identification zone over the East China part of the East China Sea. But this kind of quiet can be deceptive. On the average, 2 or 3 Chinese Coast Guard cutters intrude into Senkaku waters on average of about every 2 weeks. In fact, just before I came down here, I was perusing the Kyoto Newswire, and what I see is dateline Naha, Japan, November 9. 2 China Coast Guard vessels briefly entered Japanese territorial waters around the Senkaku. On Monday, the Japanese Coast Guard said the intrusion occurred around 10 a.m. and the ships left the waters after 1.5 hours later. It was the first such intrusion since October 24, which, by the way, is about 2 weeks ago, by Chinese vessels into territorial waters claimed by the Japanese-controlled islands. I would say, in this regard, the Chinese incursions are gradually undermining the legitimacy of Japan's claim to the Senkaku Islands. Prime Minister Abe warned of this even in an op-ed he published even before he became Prime Minister again, when he said, quote, "By making these boats' presence appear ordinary, China seeks to accomplish its jurisdiction in the waters surrounding the islands as a fait accompli," unquote. One could make the case, I think, that for all practical purposes, the Senkaku are now a kind of a joint condominium between China and Japan. After all, how does Japan assert its sovereignty? It sends Coast Guard vessels into the waters. They tell everybody they encounter to leave Japanese-controlled waters. The Chinese send Coast Guard cutters into the waters. They tell anybody they encounter to leave Chinese territorial waters. So what is the difference between the two? Somebody was asking me, would the two countries actually go to war over such an insignificant thing as the uninhabited Senkaku Islands? And I would like to point out that China has gone to war 3 times in the last 40 years over uninhabited and disputed islands. The first was against Russia in 1969 over islands in the Ussuri River, which forms one of the borders with between Siberia and China. Again, in the Battle of the Paracels of 1974, they seized islands in the western Paracel Islands from South Vietnam. And more recently, in 1988, it also seized the Johnson Reef South from the Vietnamese. One might even throw in Scarborough Shoal, captured from the Philippines in the 2012, although there was no gunfire or shootings involved. None of these affairs is exactly World War III, I have to admit, but they're not inconsiderable either. Real soldiers, real sailors died in these confrontations. Real ships were sunk. And in the Johnson Reef action, the Chinese sunk 3 Vietnamese supply ships, and about 400 Vietnamese died. So, like I say, these are not inconsiderable. In a couple of these cases, the Chinese confronted either major powers like Russia or other powers that were protected by the United States. In the 1974 Battle of the Paracels, the South Vietnam was still technically allied to the United States. The Chinese correctly calculated that this late in the Vietnam War that Washington would do nothing to defend South Vietnamese territory, and that proved to be the case. The Americans warned that Chinese fighters were taking off from Hainan Island and were approaching them, but did nothing else to protect them. It's something you might remember when Washington's promised to defend the Senkaku. As tensions over the Senkaku and disquiet over rising military expenditures has awakened Japan to the fact that its southern islands were, for many years, practically undefended. For the bulk of the Japanese armed forces was concentrated in Hokkaido to guard against a theoretical attack by the Soviet Union. That theory has kind of receded into theory that the conflict on the South China Sea is a bit more than just a theory. Since then, the Japanese have been militarizing, if that's the right word, the islands that extend south from Okinawa. The tiny island of Yonaguni, which is very close to Taiwan, unless you can, I think, see Taiwan on a clear day, is being garrisoned by about 100 Japanese soldiers, where they'll have a powerful surveillance radar to keep track of what's going on over the South China Sea. Other soldiers are being stationed on Miyako Island, Ishikagi, and some other islands closer to the Kyushu. Until recently, Japanese soldiers had very little training in amphibious warfare. It was thought to be vaguely offensive in nature and thus against the Constitution. But that too is changing. Japan's Western Infantry Regiment, a force of about 3,000 people, are being trained in amphibious war, meaning retaking captured islands. They're sometimes called the Japanese Marine Corps, but they're not a separate elite group, just like the U.S. Marine Corps. Although the U.S. Marines have taken them under their wing in various training exercises of amphibious assaults at their main base at Camp Pendleton, for example, in the United States. The Japanese are not the only ones, though, practicing amphibious operations. Captain James Fennell, a former Naval Intelligence Chief for the Pacific Fleet, raised some eyebrows at the U.S. Navy Institute West Conference in 2014 when he said, quote, "We've witnessed the massive and cross-military region exercise and concluded that the plan," that's the People's Liberation Army Navy, "has been given a new task to conduct a short, sharp war to destroy Japanese forces in the East China Sea, followed by what can only be expected as a seizure of the Senkaku and possibly the southern Ryukyu Islands." The captain's opinions were published mainly in specialized publications like the Naval Proceedings Institute, but he used such blunt and colorful language. Short, sharp war has become kind of a catchphrase these days. That has found its way into the civilian press. The leaders, Navy leaders, were not pleased with this because want to, they're focused on building ties with China's new and powerful navy. But in late 2014, the captain was reassigned from his sensitive post to become an aide to a rear admiral, which is kind of unusual that a full captain would actually be an aide to a fairly low-ranking flag officer, which suggests that they wanted to kind of shut him up. China's long-standing historical grievances against Japan explain much of the belligerence that is propelling the two countries to war. So normal relations were established in 1974, despite billions in trade, despite thousands of Japanese businessmen in China and thousands of students here. The two countries have never really buried the hatchet. We all know the sources of the grievances. You're all familiar with them. But I will only say that in recent years, the Chinese seem to be picking at these scabs a lot more than they used to. For example, last year, China created a new holiday, September 3rd, which is the day that the actual surrender was accomplished. The Americans haven't celebrated VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, for decades, but the Chinese just last year set up a new holiday honoring that. In 2014, China opened a memorial in Harbin to Ang Jin-guem, the Korean who assassinated Ito Hirobumi in that city back in 1909. Korea's President Park had hoped maybe that they'd set up just a simple statue, but the Chinese went and made it into a bigger memorial along with photographs and lengthy descriptions of Japan's oppression of the Korean people during the colonial times. It's as if the United States, not happy with just having a statue to the Minuteman in Lexington, built a brand new museum dedicated to keeping the memory alive of the grievances against King George III. China also has a large breed of what they call TV generals. These are retired generals and admirals who appear on Chinese media frequently, usually from a very belligerent and extremely nationalistic and anti-Japanese point of view. One such is a retired Lieutenant Colonel Lin Mingfu. He's the author of a book called The China Dream, which was very popular in China, and more or less says that China is destined to rule Asia, not the world. But the interesting thing is that President Xi seems to have adopted this term, the China Dream, to describe his own administration. I don't know whether it's a direct connection between the two. And the official explanation of the China Dream is not as belligerent as the book is, about China's rejuvenation and so on. But we don't hear too much more of the old catchphrase of peaceful rise coming out of China. One obvious question to raise is whether the new Japanese security laws will provide for providing collective defense will make war more likely for the Japan or not. In theory, I'd say probably yes, it does. But in practice, that's a little less certain. The new laws make certain actions and under certain situations legal. They don't necessarily make them mandatory. What you have, a prime example, I think, is the turmoil in the South China Sea, as you've seen before. Washington has been putting a lot of pressure on Tokyo to join them in these patrols in the South China Sea, and the Japanese have been pretty much resisting it. One excuse is their planes and ships are already stretched thin, keeping an eye on the East China Sea. The Abe government also is not keen on joining an American-led enterprise far from shore so soon after the Donnybrook of passing the legislation. Even Shigeru Ishiba, a former Minister of Defense and a hawk, has said something to the effect that the China Sea is not our fight. Another contingency, though, that's often raised would be Japan's help in sweeping maritime bombs, mines, not bombs, should Iran seek to use them to bottom up the Strait of Hormuz and cut off Japan's one of the main sources of petroleum. It's not widely remembered that the Japanese Navy actually swept mines in the northern Persian Gulf right after the first Gulf War. But this was after a ceasefire had been signed, and presumably under the new guidelines they could sweep mines under fire with protection from American or Japanese warships. Just the other day, the Japanese launched a new minesweeper, first of a series of class. I couldn't help but wonder, though, when was the last time that launching a humble minesweeper was front-page news on the newspapers? Of course, much of what I've said tonight supposes that history and territorial issues are the real focus of disagreement and not just empty tokens in a much deeper struggle for supremacy in Asia. The Chinese may be willing to initiate a conflict with Japan for the sole purpose of breaking the alliance, undermining America's position in East Asia, and vaulting to a position of regional supremacy. This cannot be ruled out even as sanctions grow, even as suspicions grow, that China's leaders are convinced that Washington will not, in the last resort, risk escalating the conflict into a full-fledged war, no matter how many assurances that President Obama says on this issue or something else. And the time is lost. The time has passed long ago that the U.S. can just send 2 aircraft carriers in the Taiwan Strait in order to restrain China in some of its activities.
Okay, thank you very much. Now,